Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod.
As the three of us were talking and churning about something that's alive for us to share with all of you, the topic of the strength that we draw from the ancestors rose up in our conversation. And at first we were curious about it, and the more we talked around it, the more salient, the more important that it seemed, both in terms of addressing the current fascination with ancestry, particularly with the incredible ease with which we can get our genetic profiles typed and put up on big databases, and all of these connections that we're making with second, third, and 10th level cousins out there, and what's the psychological drive about it, but also that from time immemorial, people have reached backwards to the ancestors for help in one way or another. And how can we understand that in these times?
You know, we do reach back to our ancestors for help and for values, and often for identity. How important it is with things like Ancestry.com or 23andMe. I'm thinking about some of the ads I've seen on television where people are really just thrilled to know that they're, 20% this and 45% that and another percent something else. What a sense of grounding and relationship to the past that gives someone to know that this is where I came from.
Yes, there's something about expanding our personal narrative, expanding our story to almost automatically include another chapter just because we found out that our great-great-great-grandfather came from a region or had X number of children. That the expansion of our personal story is incredibly exciting.
Well, and I think it gives us a sense of context as to who we are. And that's one thing I think that's hard about being an American, is that so many of us have this kind of salad of genes kind of story, and we're not really from any one place. We can't really claim any old culture. For many of us, some of us, this is not true. And it does make you feel cut off and rootless. And there might be something about the American psyche that's informed by that, perhaps.
That is a really interesting comment, Lisa. And I'm one of those people that's a sort of all-American salad. And I remember as a child growing up, probably by the time I got to be in sixth grade or junior high, how badly I wanted an ethnicity, because I was just some sort of all-American chopped salad of a little of this, a little of that. And I had friends who were Irish, Italian, and Jewish. And I was just in love with all those sort of cultural traditions, ethnicities, music, and such a distinct sense of identity.
So in that environment, when we're raised in a really multicultural neighborhood, I think that we can feel really left out when somebody is kind of bringing the family together for a special tradition, and then we're kind of slouching back home to something that seems really ordinary or just really familiar, and how exotic it is to have friends that are doing that.
Nothing really feels like it's yours, I mean, as we all know, I love fairy tales, right? But it's not like I feel a particular link to the fairy tales from Scandinavia or fairy tales from France. I don't have a patrimony to claim in that sense because I'm sort of from wherever. So I admire all these cultures, but I don't feel like I can lay claim to any of them as kind of my personal heritage in any way. It feels a little rootless.
I think that the laying claim in our generation has a lot of energy for some reason right now. I mean, ancestry.com is, making billions of dollars in a way that in the beginning it was just kind of humming around quietly on the internet and not well noticed. But I also think that it takes a couple of generations for the pain of being an immigrant to subside in order for the younger upcoming generations to want to reclaim it. And the reason I think that is I remember my Polish grandmother, who we called babci, which is Polish for grandma. So, I would ask babci about Poland, and she really did not like to talk about it, that she would remind me that she was an American, that she wasn't Polish, that she wanted me to correct her English.
Wow.
She was very strong about it because the memories from Poland were rough. They were painful memories.
Good. Hey, Joseph, is this the grandmother that had the great nickname for you?
Oh, no, that was my other grandmother who, again, absorbed this incredible larger culture from moving into the tenements in New York, Deb, as you were saying, that even though my maternal grandmother's family had come over from Austria-Hungary, when they landed in the tenements in the Lower East Side, the Italian neighbors taught my grandma how to cook spaghetti sauce, and the Jewish neighbors taught her Yiddish. So by the time I was being raised, it really was a total chop salad, including these nicknames that would be delivered to me. But the ambivalence about carrying stories of poverty and suffering or trauma as people were being driven in exile out of countries, that I think it takes a generation or two before the trauma is extracted, and then we can come back now and want to find those stories, and I was going to say glamorize them, although I don't know that's fair.
Romanticize
them a little bit, and want to add them back into our identity.
So we're in the realm of story, aren't we?
I think partly, yes.
You know that, Joseph, your grandmother who emigrated from Poland didn't want to talk about it. Her stories and her experience were of great hardship. When we talk about being of, particular kind of descent, a particular ethnicity or something, in a way, we're really in the realm of making up a story. If this is where I came from, I have my ancestors in County Cork, and there's a huge amount here of meaning making that we bring to whatever our ethnicity or ancestry is.
Yes, it's certainly meaning making, Deb, and story. I think you're right, is certainly a big element of it. Joseph, you mentioned trauma a minute ago, and when I first became a social worker, I was working in the trauma field. And at that point, it was well known that there was intergenerational transmission of trauma. There were these studies done with the families, the descendants of Holocaust survivors. I believe there have been studies done of children of Vietnam vets as well that looked at this intergenerational transmission. And it always seemed a little bit magical, but we've since uncovered that there's actually a biologic process involved in that has to do with epigenetics, which is just really fascinating. So we know that trauma can get transmitted down to us from the ancestors. And I find that this is a fascinating kind of field of inquiry in working with individual clients. Sometimes there's something in a person's story, in a person's experience, that doesn't seem well explained by their personal biography. And at that point, I'll often ask, what about the family history? What do you know about your ancestors? And sometimes it'll come out, yes, my dad was a vet, from World War II or whatever, or My parents fled Russia in the pogroms, and you just wonder what kind of effect does that have on the psyche that maybe even is unconscious. And how are we informed in ways we don't even realize by our ancestors?
Well, one of the things that comes up, Lisa, is that even when the historic facts are faded away, the behaviors and the ways of being are cast down. And as social workers, we often see this in a very kind of parochial way, is with the idea of ACOA behaviors, or this idea that, grandmother or grandfather may have been, a dangerous alcoholic that shapes how their children have to survive that environment. And that system of values is passed down another generation, even though, let's say, the alcoholism has disappeared, but there still are accommodating behaviors.
Joseph, you just used ACOA. Do you want to tell the listeners what that is?
Oh, Adult Children of Alcoholics was a 12-step group that actually has kind of been absorbed into Al-Anon, I think, at this point. But it was this question of how family systems respond to the trauma of alcoholism, which can continue multi-generationally, even though the narrative of who's an alcoholic is dropped out of the system.
So we're really talking about emotional and intellectual genealogy in many ways, and I'm thinking about a technique that's well known to social workers and others of the Genogram, where you map out your genealogy as many generations back as you can, and try to trace what some of the family themes are. And, I know when I did it, what I discovered was how many twins there were. And it's a real pattern on my husband's side of the family, as well as on my side of the family. Now we can call it coincidence, and then I do have twins. There seem sort of serendipitous kinds of patterns, or seemingly serendipitous, as well as things like tracing a history of alcoholism. People who might have had difficulty with depression, even though it wouldn't have been called that 3 generations ago. So genealogy has a lot of different aspects to it.
Yes. And I'm thinking, we've been talking about trauma and alcoholism and these sort of negative things that can come down, but I'm aware that other things can come down too. And I have a little vignette that I found just fascinating. I saw a woman in my practice a couple of years ago who had relocated here from Colorado. And one of the reasons she was seeking treatment was because she was just so bereft at having left Colorado. She just loved the mountains, and she gave me permission to share this story, by the way. She just found that she could not feel at home here, even though she had family here and she'd grown up here, but there was something about living out there in these mountains that just pierced her soul. And she could not rest once she was back here. And eventually she wound up moving back to Colorado. And we were trying to understand this deep, deep sadness that she felt for the mountains and this sense of longing. And at one point I just said, where are your ancestors from? And so she looked around and did a little digging. And, a couple generations ago, back 200 years ago or so, her family forever and ever came from the Alps.
Oh my.
It was very moving when we realized that.
Mm.
It was very moving. She wanted to go home to the mountains.
Mm-hmm. Oh. And I'm also aware that, in that moment is such a touching moment. But again, how we make meaning of that discovery of, my generations of family came from the Alps. and that there is that sudden knowing that is a visceral and emotional click and connection. It's like, oh, that's it then. That's why. Now, whether that's symbolic or somehow genetic.
Something mysterious we don't understand.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. But it really lifts up the meaning that ancestors have for us as humans.
So in that story, there's a kind of spiritual resonance that seems to get passed down in ways that we can't even explain, maybe not even verbally. I think that there's a way in which also behaviors can be passed down from our ancestors and they continue to survive, some of which may seem mysterious or even silly, or some could even be life-saving. For instance, in my mother's lineage, we have just a little tiny line to the Gypsy culture in Austria-Hungary.
Totally does not surprise me.
That explains so much about you, Joseph.
Yeah, right? Knowing me. And of course, the Gypsies are sadly a very low status community in Europe. So of course, when people came to the United States, they would disavow a lot of that heritage. But several years ago, I just happened across a social history of the European Gypsies called Bury Me Standing. And I was reading it. It was just incredibly fascinating. And a lot of it I couldn't identify with. So clearly it was a small element of my family. But there's one thing that my grandmother used to do is that she used to scrub the roast before she would put it in the oven. I mean, she would put it in the sink with a brush, sometimes a little washboard, and she would scrub and scrub and scrub this piece of meat before she would put it in the oven. And of course, I never really thought much about it. And she never really thought much about it. I didn't think to ask her. And then it was in reading this social history that the Gypsies in Europe are descendants of East Indian musicians who had actually been forcibly brought to Europe. And then they had stayed alive, which accounts for the incredible dark skin of the Gypsy culture. But also, as they came over to Europe, the Indian purity laws also came with them and influenced this incredible culture. So just something like making sure your meat was clean, so you had to scrub it viscerally before you kind of put it in the oven. And so there are these wonderful echoes and hints about the ancestors if we're really thinking and looking for these wonderful little lines that are still talking to us.
That's an amazing story. What a great story, Joseph. You know, I'm aware that Jung had a kind of ancestor story. I believe he talks about it in MDR, in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, that there was a family rumor that he was a descendant of Goethe. And I guess the legend was that Jung's grandfather was Goethe's illegitimate son, although there's no evidence to support the story. But of course, Goethe in important ways was Jung's kind of intellectual ancestor. He was incredibly influenced by Faust. You know, that was one of the seminal texts that really worked its way into his psyche and framed a lot of his thinking about several different things.
And there's the story, too, that with such a strong intellectual connection that maybe in some way Goethe was genetically related to him.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking about your story, Joseph, which is so charming, of scrubbing the meat, of how things that are imbued with a big emotional charge can keep coming down the line to the point where people don't even know why I do this. It's just that I always do it. And my mother did it, my grandmother did it, and that somehow we get that it's important.
And that it It shapes the patina of the family, what come
Yes.
to be these marvelous, innocent eccentricities of the family, have a thread back to our ancestors that they are still alive, in the way that my grandmother made, roast. And thinking about it that way is very appealing.
And speaking of the ancestors still being alive, I mean, obviously, this is an idea or a similar idea is present in, for example, the religious practices in China, for example, which are based on, ancestor worship. And we look to our ancestors for support and for guidance. And there's also this really lovely idea that comes out of family constellations therapy, that when we do our work, when we do our psychological work, at the same time that we're healing ourselves, we are also healing our ancestors. It's just such a beautiful thought. And I think there's a real way that it's true. And Deb, I know you know a little bit more about family constellations work than I do. Do you want to talk more about that school of thought?
Sure. It's an absolutely fascinating theory and experience. And it was originated by a man named Bert Hellinger, who was German. And the way that it works is that in the present day, people who are doing this work in a group can call up the energy from an ancestor or a current family member. And that those people, maybe a person would say, well, I need to resolve something with my grandmother, some other figure from the past, my spouse, and let's say a teenage child. And so people are selected to play those roles, and the facilitator moves people around. And the people who are standing in for the grandparent are asked to say what genuinely comes up in them. They're not playing a role. As the person who is doing the work and wants to resolve an issue is talking to them as if this person is a deceased grandparent. And it is fascinating work of accessing unconscious to unconscious kind of communication between the people who are there. And it can be extremely meaningful for the person who is doing the work. That something is truly constellated in the group and in that room that gives a person that sense of knowing. Just what we talked about before, that I know that this is true. I know that this resolves the issue, that is what my grandparent would have said or done. And I'm thinking about how, ties in with something that Jung said that is a fascinating little gem of a quotation. And he says, psychologically, the central point of a human personality is the place where the ancestors are reincarnated.
Wow. Just Deb, read that once again. It's so rich.
Okay. I know this is like flourless chocolate cake here. It's dense. Psychologically, the central point of a human personality is the place where the ancestors are reincarnated.
So what do we make of that quote?
Yeah. And that's kind of what happens in family constellations work in a quite, a concretized way. And I'm thinking about family complexes and transgenerational transmission of all kinds of things.
These kind of ancestral complexes, so that it's almost like Jung is saying in the moment there, in that quote, Jung is saying that in our individual lives, part of what we are called to do is to take on the unfinished business of the ancestors.
That those are the things that were not lifted up into consciousness we're not the loose ends, that we have inherited a kind of whole making in the present that in some way heals the past.
I think Jung famously had said that the best gift a parent can give to a child is to resolve their own shadow material, because there's a way in which parents will unconsciously pressure children to live out their unlived lives. And that pressure to actualize something certainly can tumble down generations. I want to come back to the statement that you had said, Deb, that the psychological center point of the human personality is where the ancestors are reincarnated. And that evokes for me a central feeling in Jungian work that the outer manifestation of the personality has its taproot in this invisible spiritual realm, that in this imaginal world where Jung felt certain that psychological facts happened or imagined or happened spontaneously, and in that unseen world, the ancestors and any number of autonomous images continue to influence us, whether they make demands, as you had said, or by their very proximity influence how we function in this outer world. And we can call that a kind of mystical worldview, although Jung, I think, would have disliked that particular word.
Yeah, I think, Joseph, I mean, aren't you sort of saying essentially, I mean, maybe another way to put it, if I'm understanding what you're saying, is that the ancestral world becomes part of our unconscious, kind of dipping down into the collective unconscious?
Yeah, I think those terms absolutely apply, but when we're working it in a pragmatic way, I don't know, that's a funny word to mix with this particular way of thinking. But when we're doing our own work, or sometimes when we're leading clients, out of the realm of the outer senses and into the inner sensorum, into this place where the imagination reigns supreme, that there are factors, as Jung said, at the center of the personality, which are unprecedented. That yes, they come from the ancestors, and he famously talked about this 2,000-year-old man inside of himself, or 2 million-year-old man inside of him. That there are these vestigial things that are still influencing everything about ourselves, and that we can encounter them in that imaginal world, even now, in the realm of dreams, but in the realm of that kind of meditative place that Jung advocated for, just between waking and sleeping, where the inner world becomes a landscape that's populated, and that we can encounter figures. So it evokes all of that feeling to me when I think about that quote.
Mm-hmm. And there's this great diagram. I'm not sure if it's Jung's diagram. It's in Barbara Hanna's book on Jung, that has these kind of, they almost look like cutaway slices of a volcano or something. There's the individual, the family, the clan, the nation, the large group, for example, Europe. And then down toward the bottom layers, there are the primeval ancestors, the animal ancestors, and then the central fire. So I think, Joseph, that's in the same realm of what you're talking about, that there's some mysterious taproot, right, that dips all the way down to the central fire.
And that everything's connected.
And that the patterns, that everything is connected, and that we rely on some kind of a psychophysical substance that records and protects the integrity of life. It's a way of thinking that How do birds know how to build nests? How do mothers know how to care for a child? How do we know how to sense danger and move away from it? And even now, how do we know how to respond to the plague or any kind of, natural disaster? And there is this medium, which is not intellectual, that holds these patterns that sustain life.
Right. And we might refer to those as the instincts, but we can see the ancestors as kind of the carrier of the instincts. And I think about this and this kind of amazing fact that everyone alive on the planet today is the descendant of someone who survived.
We might even say that the ancestors are the authors of instincts, if we go back far enough.
Yes, we could say that, couldn't we? Yeah.
Yeah, I really like your reference, Lisa, to that diagram, how the individual is at the top of this little sort of hilltop or mountain peak, but that everything rests on something else, the family, the clan, the larger group, and that we do know these things in some very deep way. It matters to know where our forebears came from, and in some way that we can't lift up into consciousness, but we can have a felt sense of something even bigger, that we rest on life itself, that we are connected to the central fire.
Mm-hmm.
And those signals often come through the body instincts. Often in fairy tales, you'll see that the hero or the heroine is mulling over several options, for instance. And then maybe a helpful animal or even an insect will show up and make a very clear decision about this is what should be done, this is the direction to be taken. So I think right now, in this current world of coronavirus, as people are looking to the internet or some television figure or a meme, for that matter, to kind of give them information, and that information to a certain degree is probably useful. But we exist in these bodies that have hundreds of thousands, millions of years of wisdom and survival instinct and capacity to measure and respond both on a cellular level, let alone as a mammal, to what's happening. But the body has to be listened to in order to hear the ancestors talking to us.
Oh, that's really beautiful, Joseph.
Yeah. And don't those, you mentioned fairy tales, and I'm thinking about our primeval ancestors and how their voices come down to us, our common ancestors, through fairy tales. And what do they have to say to us today? And they have a lot to say. We refer to fairy tales very often.
And I think myths also. I mean, first of all, fairy tales, there's been some research recently that most of them are much, much older than we even thought. They're much, much older than we thought. But myths, too, are the sort of distillation of generation after generation of wisdom about how to live life. And it's kind of captured in these beautiful stories. Both fairy tales and myths, I think, do that.
And what Jung advocates for is the symbolic curiosity about these stories. For instance, in the Old Testament, the book of Leviticus is full of admonitions. Do this, don't do that, eat this, don't eat that, wear this, don't wear that, do this on every other day. And that advice might come to us from, 1,000, 2,000, 5,000 years ago, the Babylonian Talmud. But that's when we're taking those letters from the ancestors very, very literally. Where fairy tales and myths give us an opportunity to take the spirit of the ancestors in by deciphering the images and not taking them just exactly at face value.
The fairy tales really give us advice about how to survive. I'm thinking about what you said, Lisa. It seems so obvious, but I'm taken with it that our ancestors actually survived. And the fairy tales tell us emotionally, what does it take emotionally to overcome adversity and to be resilient and to survive and thrive. And there are something like about 5 major little pieces of wisdom that come down through fairy tales to us, that when facing adversity, one can have loving acceptance of, like the beauty learned to love the beast. There's wrathful action of the little princess who throws the frog against the wall. Trickery, flight, and battle, which is different from wrathful action.
Mm-hmm.
And there may be even more, but I'm thinking about, I've taken those to heart, and I'm thinking about, wow, in a given situation, which do I choose? Is this one where I should just sit back and say nothing, a form of not engaging or flight? Is this something where I want to confront? If there are nice little pieces of distilled wisdom about, here's some basic strategies for interaction and conflict resolution.
Mm-hmm.
As I'm listening, Deb, to that wonderful list of themes, fairy tale themes, what lifts up for me is that in each of those stories, it's the embodied, individuated feelings that often inform the heroine in the given moment. That, in Beauty and the Beast, that Beauty has an embodied, unique way that she falls in love with the Beast, that the collective, the city tells her that's a terrible idea. All the townspeople can't imagine anybody loving the Beast. But she has to separate out from everyone's fear of the Beast in order to know what is in her own heart and to be able to trust that and to respond. So even in the Frog Prince, the king, wants to tell her how to feel about it. You made a deal, and you better let that frog sleep in your bed, and you better like it, young lady. And she's, she'll bring the frog into the bedroom, but her own embodied, personal, individual feeling is to take that frog and splat it up against the wall. And if she had allowed herself to be swayed by the collective or by the father complex, she would have cut herself off from her own legitimate feelings. So I think in many of those stories, there's something very personal and very unique about the feeling function. And Jung wrote about this when he talked about the rehabilitation of the feeling function in some of his rather obscure later work, that most human beings, if we're not paying attention, have emotional experiences that are being swept through them in this collective way, and that we're really there because we don't know how to respond to all of this connectivity through phones and webs and all of this other stuff. And we're constantly listening to, this alarm-filled language. It's these ancient letters from the ancestors in the form of fairy tales that are saying that the solution is going to happen inside of your own body, in terms of what to do right in the moment. The collective can't tell you how to respond to this.
Yeah, that's really lovely. I mean, sometimes I think our ancestors set us with problems. There's like a kind of ancestral issue that comes down to us that we need to solve. And sometimes, like you're saying, Joseph, they really bring us the wisdom that we need to face novel problems that we encounter either on a personal or a collective level. I'm thinking of going back to Jung for a second and his ancestral issues. He had a complicated relationship with his own father, who in some way was kind of a failed man. He was a pastor who lost his faith, and that kind of became a problem that became Jung's life work in some way, was to solve the problem that his father couldn't. But I was interested to learn that Jung's grandfather was a prominent physician, I believe, at the University of Basel. And isn't that interesting? So there's a way that he was both kind of chewing on his father's unsolved problems, but also carrying forward the work of an earlier, of a more distant ancestor.
Jung was also exposed to the spiritualist church and this mystical world where the dead can both inhabit a medium and speak through them. His mother was part of that church and would have these kind of trances and speak in a different voice, and sometimes speak very eloquently and in a very powerful way. And Jung was also so fascinated by this phenomena. He wrote his college dissertation on the phenomena of so-called occult events, occult phenomena, and he analyzed one of his cousins who would go into trances. So he also inherited from that side of the family this feeling, at least, that the dead are around us and influencing us. In fact, he wrote down a powerful experience, his 7 Sermons to the Dead, where he actually feels in this visionary state that these pilgrims on their way to, is it Jerusalem?
I think it's, we have come back from Jerusalem where we did not find what we sought, or something like that. That's some of the opening lines, yeah.
And he enters into dialogue, and an intelligence greater than himself meets these ancestors who did not find the spirituality that they needed. He recorded it. He kept it very secret for a long time because he felt people would not understand it, or worse. And in reading it, it is kind of exquisite, actually.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's so much mysterious knowledge and helpful wisdom that we can access if we turn to the ancestors, isn't there?
In a way, that's what lives in us, I think I'm saying something more explicitly that's been implicit in all this, which is those depths are in us. That is our very own internal world, the world of psyche that goes down and down and down and down, that we have the wisdom of fairy tales, we have mythology, we have inspiration and depths that we don't always really know about, especially in a very extroverted kind of Western culture. But that's what we're made of.
And as well as that beautiful spiritual depths, I think there's really concrete wisdom from the ancestors. When I was going through the Jungian program, I was really struggling through writing my thesis. I don't terribly like to write, and I have to access this tortured internal writer, as well as getting assistance in a number of ways. It came to me in this moment of desperation to kind of call out into my soul for help. And this very vibrant image of my Polish grandmother came back to me. And I thought, yes, she's kind of the patroness of this process. She was this very strong, broad-shouldered woman. Her hands were about half as big as mine. Very salty, very direct. And the story that came back to me when I thought of her was how she told me once that when the mule was sick, she and her sisters hooked themselves up and drew the plow. And I thought, yeah, that's what I need.
Wow.
I need her to inhabit me with that same kind of muscular draft horse, no nonsense, get the job done.
Just hitch yourself to that plow and write.
And survive. And it's that world in this very impoverished Polish area of Mazurówka that was invaded by the Russians and Germans and everything else. And in that broad, muscular way, they survived and she survived. And there's a wisdom in that. And, you know, it's funny, she was a very challenging personality, although she and I got along really well. The rest of the family kind of avoided her. So my parents would drop her off and I would just kind of, you know, stay with her for a holiday. And she and I just kind of got along. And, you know, she taught me how to garden and she was a seamstress. She actually taught me how to sew a little bit, didn't say very much. And I don't know, in this nonverbal way, she communicated a stoutness of being that I still have.
That's really lovely. And I wonder if it's a good time to switch to a dream.
Hi, this is Joseph from This Jungian Life podcast. Lisa, Deb, and I have been deeply moved by your responses to our work. Producing, editing, and distributing it involves substantial expenses, and now we need your help. Please stop by our website, thisjungianlife.com, and click on the heading Be Our Patron. You'll be redirected to our Patreon funding page. Patreon helps creators connect with people who believe in projects like ours. There, you can sign up with your credit card to support us with as little as $1 a month. And at higher levels of support, we'll provide special episodes, behind-the-scenes photos and stories, and a chance to join a select pool of listeners for dream interpretations. Thank you.
Today's dream comes from a male who is 25 years old, and he does employment agency work. And here's the dream. I was in a quaint English village. Next to the village ran a river, and on the other side of this river were fields. A traditional Cotswold stone bridge joined both sides of this river. Suddenly, I seemed to be competing in some sort of local race. I was competing in this race against two friends, girls, who were unknown to me. I remember pushing myself past one of the girls to place first in this race. I remember feeling a little self-conscious of the fact that I had not let this friend of mine win, and hoped that she didn't think I was being a dick. The race centered and finished around the bridge, joining both sides of the river. As I stood on the bridge and looked down at the river, I noticed a dog, possibly a Springer Spaniel, was drowning. I felt a strong urge to save this dog and felt sad that it was in such distress. As I looked on in horror, I noticed some netting was beginning to cover the surface of the river, a bit like when you cover a pond or swimming pool. I knew at that point the dog was going to die as it could no longer come up for air. I could hear sirens in the distance, which seemed to indicate both the possibility of help and danger in the form of police sirens, someone coming to reprimand me. It was forbidden to jump in the river, but I did it anyway. I pulled the dog out of the river, at which point I noticed it had morphed into a seal. I began to care for this seal, and in doing so, it again morphed into a small, podgy young boy. I held the young boy in my arms, and I told myself, I'd do it all again, despite the potential danger. I was relieved I had saved the dog, seal, young boy. There was a sense of heroic accomplishment. Now, here's some associations. I suffered a drug-induced psychosis at age 19. I was diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder and mild depressive disorder not too long after this happened. I've struggled with anxiety all my life, and it's only recently, after having a nervous breakdown last year, that I began to make some significant changes to the way in which I live my life. I moved back in with my parents to continue my psychotherapy and hope that one day I'm able to go out in the world and be an independent adult without feeling completely overwhelmed, depressed, and anxious. And in terms of the feelings in the dream, he says, relieved to have saved the dog, confusion as to the significance of the seal. There were no bad feelings associated with this dream other than the sirens in the distance, which I'll tell you now is not exactly true. But that's what the dreamer has. I noticed the other bad feeling is that he feels kind of guilty about pushing the friend aside, right? That's the other bad feeling in the dream. So, such an interesting dream filled with really rich imagery. What do we think?
I'm just going to start with my own felt reaction. And the reason that I do that is that I think it can be a kind of tuning fork reaction of something resonates in me that is important to the dream and the dreamer. I could feel my own feeling and my tearing up of, it was like reading a fairy tale of, oh no, there's this dog and it's drowning and there's a net over it. And then how moving it was that he jumps in anyway. And what happens? It morphs into a seal and then a young boy, which feels really important psychically, just from my own felt reaction to the dream. It was very powerful. If the dreamer were here, I could offer him that, because sometimes it's very useful.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And sometimes, of course, it's just my reaction.
Where I want to start with this dream is, first of all, there's this image of the village with the river and the fields and this bridge. So the bridge plays this major role in the first part of the dream. It seems to be kind of the center of it. It's the center of this race. It kind of begins there and ends there. And so that's interesting. What is getting bridged? It seems like that's working well, whatever that function is. I'm really interested in this race against these two girls. And the fact that the dream ego pushes past one of the girls and places first. There's really a sense of something having been violated there, in my opinion, that the ego perhaps has edged out some important content from the unconscious. And that view is supported by the fact that the next thing that happens is that he stands on the bridge and he sees a dog drowning. So this sense of causality in dreams being linked to chronology. So one thing happens and then another thing happens. We assume, or perhaps we consider, that they might be linked causally. So something like when the ego pushes out this feminine energy, let's say, then the dog is in danger. The instinctual life is endangered.
So that could be a tale of this young man not being sure how to relate to the anima, to the inner feminine sensitivities and sensibilities. And I can understand that interpretation. I wanted to come to it from a slightly different angle, which to me lands around the idea of winning and around masculine psychology. That as a man who is, rising forward or trying to launch after a major setback, that he finds this energy to win, to decide that he should be number one and that he shouldn't hold himself back just to protect the feelings of a friend. But this competitive spirit is allowed to come forward. And when the competitive winning part of him comes forward, what emerges is the traumatized, vulnerable, young, masculine part of himself becomes visible. And it's in the unconscious. It's paddling around in the water. Now, The ego is often the least reliable interpreter of what's happening. He thinks it's drowning, but what he discovers is that it's actually a selkie. Now, in ancient Gaelic mythology, Scottish and Irish, the selkie, who are called the seal folk, are able to transform themselves into seals and as human beings. And it's this mythic kind of world that there's a part of his psyche that is involved with the boy in him that is between the worlds, is kind of a fairy folk, and is kind of a boy that he needs to rescue. And part of his rescuing is to rescue himself from the world of the fairy folk, which is the world of psychosis, from drowning in the mythologic world. Now, there is a cautionary piece in that fairy tale that there are the children of when a selkie breeds with a human being. Often the children, their offspring, are strange and marked by being otherworldly. So the dream also points me to this feeling that one of his parents also brought into the parenting field, if not genetically, a predisposition for the fairy world, a predisposition of the mark of the fae. So him claiming his boy in this act of winning and reclaiming himself out of this fantastical world and into the world of competition and running the race of being a young man and letting himself want to win a race, i.e. finish college, get a career, get a romantic partner that you're motivated for, and that you're going to have this boy in your arms during that whole race as part of your healing process. That's how it lands for me.
It's really interesting. I like that. I think there's a lot in there. I'm not totally agreeing with you. And so I want to just lay mine out. And of course they could both be right too. But just picking up, see, for me, he doesn't just run faster than the girl. He pushes past her, which is kind of foul play. So I'm still with, there's something about that wasn't, that shows some misalignment of the conscious attitude vis-a-vis the anima maybe, or some unconscious content. And then he's standing on the bridge and he sees the dog drowning. And one of the next thing that happens is he could hear sirens in the distance. And he says, someone is coming to reprimand me. Reprimand him for what? So there's a sense of the collective coming to kind of pass judgment on something that he did. And so again, I'm going back to pushing the girl out of the way. Something's been done that shouldn't have been done. But then he does rectify it by jumping in to save the dog. So some kind of instinctual content. And as he moves toward the dog, it becomes more humanized, right? Because one of the things about seals that's so uncanny is their eyes are so human-like. So a seal looks much more human than a dog. And then, of course, it completes its transformation and it's a boy. And then he feels a sense of heroic accomplishment.
So here's my take on it, and I'm appreciating both of yours. So I'm thinking about it in terms of feeling function. He has access to his aggression. First of all, there's a bridge. So what's a bridge? Well, it connects opposite sides, literally, of a river, but in the psyche, there is a connection is now there. And he pushes her out of the way. He's in a race, and he wants to win. And he hopes that this girl doesn't think that he's being a dick. So he's transgressing.
Mm-hmm.
He's putting himself first. I want to win. And then the rest of the dream unfolds with the dog and jumping in and all the rest of it. And again, that collective thing of the sirens, he broke a rule. He should have been a really nice guy, and he shouldn't have pushed past, et cetera, et cetera. But he again accesses his heroic masculine energy to jump in and save the dog, and then all these transformations take place that you really unpacked, Joseph. And at the end, there is a sense of heroic accomplishment, and he is at the age where it's exactly the age for the hero's journey.
Yeah, and definitely the dream has this really satisfying lysis.
Very satisfying lysis. It's a very affirming lysis. And at the end, he says, well, in his comments that he struggled with anxiety, and that he'd like to be able to go out in the world and be an independent adult without feeling overwhelmed and anxious. And this dream is very encouraging about that.
Yes, it is. It is.
There's a way in which, when aggression is disallowed in the family system or in the culture, that the aggressive impulses, when they rise up, create a tremendous amount of anxiety, either in a girl or a boy. So all the alarms, the sirens sound when he is aggressive, either through pushing or breaking the rule of jumping in the river. But despite all of the alarms, as you said, Deb, he marvelously, beautifully exercises this healthy aggression, this ability to fight for something, fight for himself. And I think as a young man, the ego is the primary refining object. I mean, there's a time to be concerned about the anima and about softness and accommodation and perhaps even the soul or spiritual world. And that may need to happen later in his life. But right now, he may have to be tougher and then come back to these softer internal sensibilities in another 20 years. I think we all agree that the dream is offering real help to this guy, and I think we all kind of like him. There's something really appealing.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely.
We do.
It's a great dream. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.